our Cocktails, COVID, and Conversation program. We thank you for joining us this evening. As you know, we have been running these programs on a bi-weekly basis and have had an amazing array of speakers. We've been very fortunate that we have many talented and interesting members, as well as community members who have participated and offered to give programs for our members, volunteers, and the community. So we thank you for joining us. It's our pleasure to be able to open this to the community. Tonight, our presentation is by Joy Billington Doty. And Joy joined Georgetown Village in 2013 and has been an active member participating in programs and going on trips with us. Previously, we were privileged to hear Joy speak about her 4 first ladies and her experiences in the White House. Joy worked as a reporter for the Washington Star for many years and then was the Entertainment Tonight's Washington reporter, which I always think sounded like such a cool job. Joy covered the Reagan administration for the San Diego Union after the demise of the Star, and she began her career as a journalist in Singapore. Following that, she's written for the Times of London, so Joy has really had quite an international career. Joy is the author of 6 books, one of which was co-written with her late husband. Joy will be offering a unique perspective on her experiences of living in DC as a foreign journalist. And I know that we are in for a treat with this presentation. Again, we ask that you save your questions until the end of the program. Joy will leave you time to ask questions. And when you have questions, if you'd either raise your hand either electronically or wave to me, I will ask you to unmute and then be able to speak directly with Joy. So I don't want to take any more of her time. I thank her, and Joy, we're really pleased that you were willing to do this with us. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Okay, Joy, it is all yours. Whoops, Joy, you are muted. You need to unmute. Whoops. Okay, here comes Tech Assistant. He's coming. I can see he's coming. So just bear with us a second. That's probably, just give us a second. Joy will be unmuted. We've already checked and everything is working fine on this. Okay, Joy, I'm going to ask you to unmute. So all you have to do is press that little button. And there you go. Okay, you should have, there you are. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Well, I don't know how many you are because I can only see 1, 2, 3, 4 pictures. But nevertheless, I'll start with my first day in Washington, which was in 1967. Which is 53 years ago. It was a March day and the river was full of ice blocks. I mean, I've never seen another scene like that. The blocks were almost piled up as high as the bridges. And I was freezing, and I thought, I didn't think it was going to last. I mean, I was going to last. So anyway, I came over from the London Times with a series of assignments, one of which was to go down to Texas. Well, that was for the Telegraph, actually, to go down to Texas to write about a series of essays about Lyndon Johnson and his Texans, who were still in the White House then. And they were a good crew of people, and it was great fun I met some of them before I left. And then I went down to Texas and went first to the King Ranch, which was really interesting. It was so huge. And the PR person had an airplane to fly around the King Ranch. It was so enormous. And they taught me about the Mexican vaqueros who came over with the beginning of the King Ranch, was Clayburgh. And they showed me the vaqueros breaking down the cattle, or sort of, what's the word? Making them, putting their stamp on them. There's a name for it. Anyway, that was fascinating. And then I did the Lyndon Johnson's ranch, which was the first time I had come across Lyndon Johnson. And there were a crowd of people there because he was celebrating the Latin American group. It was something to do with a Latin American women. No, it wasn't. It was all the ambassadors from Latin American countries had. I remember, it was Hemisphere. It was called Hemisphere. And he was strolling around outside the ranch. Betty Beale, who was a columnist on the Star, went up to him and slung her arm around him. And I was amazed to see this. I mean, I didn't realize that anybody had that kind of access to the president. And certainly not a journalist. But she had known him for years because he was in the Senate for a long time, as you no doubt recall. And he was very good with people, and in a very, very bluff Texan manner. And he was a very, very crude man, but also his heart was in the right place. I mean, there was no doubt that he had education on his agenda. I mean, he was being bogged down by Vietnam, but nevertheless, a big part of his agenda was education, and so he was a goodly president. Anyway, we went down. Oh, I stayed with Lillian Owen. Lillian de Tagle was a friend from the Voice of America. She became a friend, and she and I roomed together overnight in San Antonio. And that was when I really got to know the crew, who were all led by the wonderful Liz Carpenter. Now, Liz was LBJ's press secretary, well, and Lady Bird's also. And I don't know if you realize, when Washington has its spring daffodil explosion of flowers, that Lady Bird, in fact, planted most of those, not herself, but it was one of her projects. Now, as far as the telegraph pieces, I was doing Lyndon Johnson, the ranch, and Brown and Root was a big Texas company, and I had to interview the leader of that. And then I did some other things, like I interviewed an elderly man in Midland. Midland was way out in West Texas, very, very strange city where the Bushes had made their fortune. Anyway, he was just a little old gardener. So it wasn't only leaders, it was everybody. I wanted to spread it out wider. So I talked to him, and he had come down. He was an elderly gentleman. He'd come down from Oklahoma on a wagon train, and he said he'd seen some Indians massacring people.
Wow.
Massacring was not a word I was familiar with, but I figured it out. It meant massacring. But he was a sweet old gentleman, and he was the son of Larry King, who was in Washington. Larry King of the greatest little whorehouse in Texas, not Larry King of the other ilk. Anyway, Liz Carpenter was wonderful, roly-poly, plump, down to earth, very down to earth, and great fun. And she introduced me and she used to roll on Air Force One or Air Force Two. It was because we were flying with Ladybird. She'd roll oranges down the plane as it took off. So Liz was a great person and great fun and very influential. I mean, if she needed to tell something to LBJ, she did. She didn't hang back and she and Ladybird were very close. She was expert, perfect for the role of press secretary. Anyway, so that was my introduction to Texas, and then I came back to Washington with a bad cold because I'd been flying around in private aircraft. Everybody had a private aircraft, and so and they were all small aircrafts, small planes, and not very well insulated in those days. I mean, so I had a terrible cold, and my ears were blocked, and I was very sick for several weeks after that. So that was my first year. I spent a lot of time that first year also because I decided I was going to stay in Washington because I was so delighted with the access to the first family. I thought, this is amazing, and I've got to stay here. And so I did, and I was very little, hadn't any money. I had like $500 at the most in my bank account. And Sue Puddifoot, who was my editor on the Times, would try to get money to me as quickly as possible because she knew I was broke. And so I got 10 cents a word from the Voice of America magazines. The Voice of America had a lot of magazines in those days, and they were always looking for pieces. So I would very carefully add up my words, and 10 cents, 10 cents, 10 cents, until I made enough to pay for the rental of the apartment I was living in. I was living all over Georgetown in those days. I started out with, where did I start? On 28th Street. And I rented a house for the summer with Lillian Owen, who was a great friend of mine in those days. She's dead now. Lillian was responsible for passing me on to her friends, who were all Democrats anyway. So they would all get together and decide where I should live. And that went on until I met my husband, Joseph, which is a separate story in itself. By this time I joined the Star, and he had gone down. He was the headmaster of Georgetown Prep, and he'd gone down to. He was a Jesuit. He'd gone down to Rehoboth with his secretary and her husband. I had gone down with Jack Lydgate, who was a professor at Georgetown of English, and he'd asked me down for the weekend. Now this, I said to the people, my friends at the Washington Star, I'm not going to this place. Where is it? It's too far for my elderly car, because by this time I bought a $400 car from Paul, what was his name? New York Daily News, anyway. And this car had a drift to the left, so which was fine with me politically, but it was a definite, and it took me 5 hours to get down to Bethany instead of 3 hours, which takes a normal person. And I was scared stiff of going over the Bay Bridge. And anyway, when I got down to Bethany, I said to my host, I'm not driving back. So he said, don't worry, there's people, some students on the beach will drive you back, your car back. Well, it never happened. And so on the Sunday morning, I had to call the local car rental in the hope that somebody needed a car to get back to Washington. Well, it happened that Joe did, because his ride had changed plans. Anyway, he needed to get back to Washington. And so he called them, and I had already called them and said, I don't want to interfere with your rentals, but if anybody calls who needs a car, well, just tell them to call me, because I've got one. So he called me and said, well, he'd like to take up my offer and drive his, and he'd come over and pick it up. Well, he did. And he wasn't looking a bit like a Jesuit. He was looking like a young 40-year-old man, and handsome. And so we managed to discuss my son's education. My son being an English boy who was coming up about 12 or 13 at that point. And we talked for so long that the judge who brought him in his car got impatient and had to get out of his car and come and say to Joseph, well, don't you think we ought to go? So anyway, I'd married Joseph by that time. Is that where I am? Yeah, I think so. we were married in 1969, and he left the Jesuits. He became an Episcopalian. The Bishop of Washington, who was at that time Bishop Creighton, took him on. He only needed to study the Elizabethan Henry VIII and that whole era, and because otherwise he didn't need to brush up his anything, because he was an expert. He was a Latinist and a Greekist, and he'd done, and he was the headmaster of a huge prep school. So when he joined the Episcopalians, he did it with ease, and he was received by the bishop, and then he had his first job was at National Cathedral School for Girls, where he was the chaplain and assistant head. So we begun our marriage in at St. Stephen's and the Incarnation, which was the church at that time where Bill went, was in control of everybody, and it was very much a black and white church. It was on 16th Street, and the congregation was half black and half white, and they all enjoyed each other, and it was a really great place. So that was where we were married, but at that time, I think we were living on 27th Street, 1316 27th Street. It was a tiny little house, 10 feet wide and 30 feet deep. And it had a little tiny garden. And it had a closet up on the second floor, and a bedroom and a bathroom. Well, I got a builder in and asked him to put a window in. So he put a window in, and then I built up this room to look like my father's ship's cabin. And my son, who was only 5'7" at that time, he could sleep there when he came on holiday until he was 6 foot, and then he'd have to sleep with his feet out the window. So I mean, it was really a very sweet and tight little cabin. Anyway, Joe and I were very happy, and we'd ask friends out for and we'd have drinks on the little terrace, and then we'd go over to Rose Park with somebody carrying the candles, somebody carrying the bouillabaisse, because I always made bouillabaisse, somebody carrying the plates, and we'd eat at one of those picnic benches. And that was my alfresco kind of dining at those days. This was when Joe was still at National Cathedral, and the riots had begun with Nixon, and the Vietnam troubles were beginning they were getting much, much greater. And that was when Nixon came in, and I was on the Star, and Joe was at the Cathedral, and Washington began the Nixon years. And the most amazing thing about that is Martha Mitchell, her role in in the Watergate. She talked to my friend Helen Thomas a lot, and Helen Thomas made a lot of news out of it because she was being suppressed, and probably rightfully, because who wants a wife who a cabinet wife who hasn't any guard on her tongue? And she had no guard on her tongue, which delighted us who were covering Nixon, but didn't please them. Helen Smith was Pat Nixon's press secretary. Helen Smith was a very nice, quiet lady who had been the New York Daily News secretary to the bureau chief. She didn't really have any experience with dealing with antagonism. And so she was too quiet and too good and too restrained and too English to manage to control this bunch of extremely vociferous reporters. And poor Helen, she managed, and I think Mrs. Nixon didn't expect anything more, because Mrs. Nixon was such a private person that she didn't have any need for a good PR. Well, she might have had a need for a good PR, but she didn't. She in fact was willing to have a quiet English lady with good manners represent her as a press secretary. That was a time when, I must say, I've always had a great relationship with women, and women had played a great part in my life at that point. I mean, and have subsequently. I mean, my first job in Singapore was initiated by a girl called Nan Hall, who was on the opposition paper. And I will never forget or thank Nan Hall enough for getting me my job on the Singapore Standard. And then Sue Puddifoot, who took me on the Times. And then Gwen Dobson. Gwen Dobson was the editor of the portfolio section on the Star. And they were all good women. And we were all, in those days, quite uncompetitive by comparison to today. I would hate to be a reporter today. I couldn't bear it for 1 second. So Helen Smith, she and Mrs. Nixon got on very well. There were lots of state dinners then. Nixon entertained a lot, mainly foreign policy stuff, mainly foreign leaders. And I always liked to get into the foreign press and find out what was really going on, what they wanted, not what they were getting, but what they wanted to get. So I enjoyed quizzing the foreign press, which in fact nobody had done traditionally with the in the Washington Press Corps, because the Washington Press Corps just assumed that America was the beginning and the end of everything. So, you know, never mind what the Iranians wanted, never mind what everybody but the Israelis accepted. That's a good example. That was an exception. Anyway, he had these state dinners regularly. And we used to cover them. And I always covered them because Isabel Shelton was the technically covering the Nixon administration. But I managed to finesse going because I knew something about this foreign country. And so I managed to finesse that. So that was a time of great learning for me. I mean, learning about the politics of the senators, the situation of Washington, I had never known much previously about politics. I hadn't really cared much, except that I am a good socialist, and so I had voted for the socialists in 1964 when Harold Wilson was elected. So I was very proud of that. But nevertheless, I didn't really. It was a learning process during those 7 years of the Nixons. I mean, as an example of how foolishly we went to see a play, a Doll's House, Ibsen's play, and Mrs. Nixon and Helen Smith and I and two other reporters were coming out after the play, and I was so carried away by the Doll's House, and I was so engaged up and thinking about it, that I said, Mrs. Nixon, did you ever want to leave your husband? So, poor Mrs. Nixon, she just rolled her eyes, and and Helen almost died of embarrassment. Of course, it was a very stupid question, because of course she wanted to leave her husband occasionally, often. And but there was no way she could have answered that. So it was a stupid question. Anyway, I managed in those days to get away with stupid questions. Anyway, this was a time when we were, Joe and I were traveling a lot. I managed to finagle the Washington Star into giving me 3 months off or 2 months off or 1 month off to go so I could interview Mrs. Gandhi in India, and then go on up to Kashmir to stay with L.K. Jha, who was the governor of Kashmir. And the King of Thailand, I had Phumviphan. I went to interview him in Thailand, where I had lived, and I knew a lot of, I still had friends there. Anyway, Mrs. Gandhi was a very interesting person, and I liked her a lot, although she got terribly hung up over the Golden Temple, and she paid for it dearly with her life. And then there was the Nixon administration in '74 came to an abrupt end when Nixon resigned. And suddenly it was the Ford administration. And there was a lot of, it was 74 he resigned, 76 came the bicentennial, and Ford was in control of the whole of the celebration, and everybody in the world, all the leaders of the world wanted to come and congratulate the United States on 200 years of fairly peaceable existence. Anyway, the Queen came, and Peter Ramsbottom was the British ambassador then. He was a wonderful ambassador. And there was a time when we were all around in the garden of the British Embassy, and you aren't supposed to go up, as you probably know, to address the Queen in a situation like this. And so the reporters are all milling around, but all trying to get to the Queen, but without appearing to. Anyway, I managed to edge in, and I said, after a few minutes, I said, Ma'am, we're going to have dinner in a tent tonight. So she said, oh, will there be punkah wallahs? Well, I knew what a punkah wallah was, and she knew what a punkah wallah was, but most of us didn't. And I'm guessing you don't. It's an Indian word for a little boy who sits on the floor and has a string tied around his big toe, and the fans go back and forth, back and forth. Well, this is a long dead habit in India. I mean, but she was making a joke, and I was so delighted to see the Queen making a joke, and we all laughed. And I said, no, Mum, there won't be any punkah wallahs tonight, but you'll be having air conditioning. And so she just said, okay, well, that's all right. And so that was a nice event for me. And another time of that, that was when Peter Ramsbottom was still ambassador, although later he was dismissed as ambassador and sent as governor of Bermuda because, well, never mind why. He was he was considered a fuddy-duddy because he was an older man, and the British press was very wicked in those days. I mean, they're still wicked, but they called him an old fuddy-duddy when Carter was coming in, and they needed someone bright and new, so he got the chop. And another event, well, during those years, I got to be very good friends with Shirley Temple Black, and that was fascinating because she became chief of protocol, and she was wonderful, and I have always liked. I've always watched her old movies. I've seen them many times, but when she brought out her first half of her biography, she was down to earth and ordinary and uncomplaining, that her father had used all her money. She'd relied on her parents, and he had just run through all, he was a bank manager. He'd run through all her money. And when she married and John Agar, I think it was, and then she married later Charlie Black, she didn't have a penny, well, hardly anything. He'd just spent all her money. And you can't imagine how much that must have been. Anyway, she was a good chief of protocol, and everybody liked her. We went to party where I was covering the embassies at that time, as well as the White House. And we'd see each other at embassy parties and often ride home together. Now we're into the Ford years. Sheila Weidenfeld was the press secretary. Princess Anne made a visit during that time, and she was pregnant with her second child. And she was enormous. I mean, she wasn't fully out, but she was certainly 6 months. And it was summertime. There were mob scenes on the British Embassy garden. And Peter managed to introduce me. And she said, well, why did you leave England? And I said, male chauvinism, madam. I mean, not madam, but mom, because you call her mom too. And she said, oh yes, male chauvinism. Well, I know about that. And that was the end of that brief conversation, because I found it far less chauvinistic here than it had been in England. Anyway, so that is, at this point, Joseph had come with me to India, and he'd gone back when I'd finished interviewing Mrs. Gandhi, and he had come back to Washington. By this time, he had decided he was 7 years at National Cathedral School as chaplain and assistant head. He decided he was a little restless. He longed to be a headmaster again. So he started looking, and he very quickly became headmaster of St. Stephen's School in Alexandria. So this was at the beginning of the Carter administration. It was 1977, I think, and I was very unhappy about this move to Virginia. I didn't want to go across the river. I didn't want to leave DC. I said, no, I won't go. No, I won't go. I woke up every morning saying, no, I won't go. Like the protesters on the Vietnam. However, I decided that he did go. He wanted to go, so we became headmaster of St. Stephen's School in Alexandria. That meant we had to live over there and near the seminary, and it was a misery for me but it was good for Joseph, so he was fine. Anyway, I had to commute up and down 95 every day to the White House, because I had been appointed by that time to cover Mrs. Carter, which of course was a great pleasure. And my friend Marianne Dolan, who was the editor of Star for a short while, well, the editor of my section, and she appointed me to cover Mrs. Carter, which was a great surprise, because I didn't think that being an English person, that I could get to cover any First Lady. But so I did cover Mrs. Carter, and I covered her very well, I think, in retrospect. I think I understood her better than most of the others, because I had a sympathy for her religious side, which the others probably didn't. And also, I admired Jimmy Carter, and I still do. I went down to see Mrs. Carter a short while ago. Amy, of course, was there by that time, a grown-up woman, and she popped into the office while I was with Mrs. Carter. But they have been wonderfully careful not to shame the presidency. They have been such good ex-president and ex-first lady. They've been such a good example to the country. And of course, he was let down by his terrible staff, who I will not go on about, but they were so foolish. I mean, really. I think an example of a good example of the foolishness was when what was his name? The first I forget his name. Jody Powell was one of them, and it wasn't Jody, it was the other one. And he was sitting next to the Egyptian ambassador, Ashraf Gobal, and Mrs. Gobal was sitting next to him. And they were at a dinner party. And she said, she didn't say anything. He said, he'd had a lot to drink, as he usually did. Oh, now I can see why the pyramid. Now I know, I've seen the pyramids. When Mrs. Gobal just bent over and showed her bosom. So that was an example of their ineptitude, their ignorance about Washington, and their stupidity. So they were, no wonder Carter lost his election, because they were all such a rotten crew of people. They were. Mary Hoyt was the press secretary of those days. Mary Hoyt was quite a good press secretary. She was a little cool, a little reserved, she was very efficient. We did the mental health bit when Rosalind Carter was going out around the country trying to assess mental health, which of course is still a problem today. It's more of a problem than it was then. She was just trying to gauge the amount of help was needed by the mental health communities around the country. And she had hearings in Chicago and LA and all around the country, trying to assess their needs and trying to figure it out. Because she knew from her own experience in Georgia that there was a lot of mental health there were a lot of mental health problems among the poor, and she wanted to help. But in the end, it all got turned around because when Reagan came in, having won the election in 1980, Mrs. Carter's efforts were all lost. So that was very sad. And it was sad to watch her going around because she was campaigning for him because he was bogged down with the Iranian crisis, the hostage crisis. And so he had to concentrate on that. So Rosalind was trying very hard to win the election. Gosh, it's only a while ago, it seems to me.
Well, time certainly does go quickly. And speaking of time going quickly,
we've got. Well, we can't. Oh well, no, it's not time yet, Lynn.
Oh, okay. Well, you have a few more minutes, but we did.
Okay. Well, I'll just do the Reagan administration.
Okay.
And then we'll quit. Reagan had a wonderful. Sheila Tate was the Reagan press, Nancy Reagan's press secretary. She was so good. She was so first class, and she came on board the Reagans after Ruth Orr. That was a disastrous little first press secretary was appointed by Mike Deaver, and then they realized after a week that the Ruth Orr, who was a West Coast press secretary, a West Coast reporter, would never work out. So they got a Washington professional, Sheila Tate, and they made her into the woman who Nancy Reagan managed to turn around her image, because she had a bad image, a bad press. She'd been having too much focus on clothes, too much focus on how she looked, what jewels she was wearing. And then Sheila Tate brilliantly reversed the situation at the Gridiron dinner by having her dress up in old clothes, and she came on the stage singing "Secondhand Rose," which was a brilliant a brilliant change which resulted in a total change of her attitude. I mean, her reputation. So I guess that's it. I'll close by reminding you of what Elizabeth Taylor, who I covered when he was running for the Senate. Elizabeth and I were going on a plane, and we're both scared of airplanes. And Elizabeth said, no, you've got to be quiet. You just listen to me. And she took out her lipstick, and she made me take out my lipstick, and we plastered our lips as we took off. We were very busily plastering our lips with lipstick. And she said, we were off in the wild blue yonder. So that's where I am, in the wild blue yonder still. And
Well,
I'll
that's
say good night.
wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us. It's really been great. We will now open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please either raise your hand electronically or physically. Tony, I see you, so I'm asking you to unmute so that you can ask your question. And while Tony's unmuting, I just wanted to say that from what you were saying, first of all, I wanted to let everybody know that the pictures behind Joy, she actually did those pictures. They're her works of art. So you should know that Joy has many talents in addition to being a writer. I did want to share that. So Tony, you had a question. Go for it.
Yeah, Joy, that was just delightful. I loved having the whole review, but I do have a specific question, which you almost talked about, but I think you just skipped over. Was the battle between Raisa Gorbachev and Nancy Reagan, right, in that early phase when they were, the irony is that Raisa was criticized for exactly the same thing in Russia. They hated the fact that she was so fancy and bought clothes in Europe. But what happened with Nancy Reagan?
It was just a natural coldness between the two. I mean, although to give Nancy her due, she did say, who was it she said it to? I'll whisper in his ear every night, peace. And she said, no, it was not to Gorbachev, but to the Russian Foreign Secretary. She said, I'll whisper in his ear every night, peace, peace. So, but apart from that, they had a natural distaste for each other.
Well, I'm sure part of that was the time as well.
Was what?
Was the political times as
Oh,
well.
yes.
Were there any other questions or comments or thoughts anybody wanted to share after hearing this interesting, fascinating, very well-lived adventures here? I will say that from something you said at the very beginning, it occurred to me that in your perspective, Americans were much more informal than British journalists. You were commenting, yes, that when you started, somebody gave you a hug and you were surprised that they were so open and warm.
Yes, because when I met Joe, I mean, the priesthood, the Roman Catholic priesthood in England was still pretty repressed.
Right. Are there any, Sarah, did you have a question? I can't tell. No. Okay. So somebody asked in the chat, Emily Baker wanted to know, how did you come to go to Singapore?
Oh, well, that's not a short story. That is a long story, but my father took me to Australia when I was 18, and I went kicking and screaming and hated it. So I had 3 miserable years in Australia. And then I ran away to Singapore because it was the nearest civilized place I could find to West Australia. So that's when I got my first job in journalism with Nan Hall's help.
Very interesting. Are there any other questions before we thank Joy? And also before I thank Joy, I just want to let everyone know that our next Cocktails, COVID and Conversation will be on October 28th, when we are having Sherry Green, who's a senior fellow at the Wilson Center, and she'll be speaking about climate and COVID and tackling the greatest challenges, which will also be a very interesting program. These programs are open to the community. We hope you will join us again. And I know you join me in thanking Joy for sharing so much and really being so open and honest about your experiences. It was really a delightful, delightful presentation. Thank you.
There's one thing I have to add. I can't bear it to end here. I need to say that always I've enjoyed America with every presidency looking towards the future with hope until this time. And there's no hope now.
Well, I think there's hope if we all get out and vote, and we're not going to go political here, but I am going to encourage everybody to please vote. Vote your heart, vote what you want to happen, and let's keep our fingers crossed. So on that note, thank you for joining us, and Joy, thank you so much. It really was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
All
Joy.
right, Joy.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
My pleasure.